All right, ladies and gentlemen, we will get started. We will start the session on the implication of the Russia-Ukrainian war on the Korean and the implication of the Russia-Ukrainian war on the Korean Peninsula. And my name is Jae-Seung. I'm the moderator of this session, and I'm currently teaching at Korea University, the College of International Studies. We do have a bio in the program, but somehow it is very weird situation, but my the bio was wrongly printed, and somehow I find Honorable Professor Kim Yeon-chol in my bio, but the picture and name will be right. So I'm correcting my background. Somehow I found my another past. So I'm as a foreign policy expert and as a scholar in international politics, I've been working on the issue, especially the issue of European affairs and Korea-Europe relation, and I'm also serving as Jean Monnet Chair of the European Union and teaching at Korea University. We have 4 excellent panelists, but by the way, so this session is translated simultaneously, so you can choose your favorite language. So if you are listening to if you want Korean, then press 1, and for English, press 2. And if you want to speak to the moderator, then press 0, and nobody will answer. Okay, we have 4 excellent panelists first we have Dr. Antoine BONDAZ from France, and he's currently a director of Korea program at Fondation de Recherche Stratégique, Foundation for Strategic Research, and he's nowadays one of the most active scholar working on Korean issues, China issues, and especially on the security agenda. So very glad to have Antoine BONDAZ in this panel and also in this conference. And we have Jean Lee. Jean Lee is currently a public policy fellow at Wilson Center, but she's been equally or even more famous for a prominent journalist. She is currently hosting the Lazarus Heist, the podcast with BBC, but she has worked for a long time at AP. So as a journalist, and also so she is bringing a very brilliant and very reality-based the perspective on these issues. And we have prominent scholar from Korea, Professor Park Young-jun. He's a professor at Korea National Defense University. And well, he has, actually he doesn't need a lot of the introduction. He is a leading scholar. He's a leading scholar in researching and commenting, and also doing a lot of policy advice on the issue of the global security issues, the international politics, and on the Korean Peninsula issues. And lastly, but not leastly, we have Professor Kim Inhan from Ewha Women's University. He used to teach at Colorado Springs, but he joined the Ewha University, and he recently also got the post of vice president for international cooperation. So very active but most of all as a prominent scholar in international relations. I'm also very happy to have him in this session. Okay, so So we have 4 presenter, and each panelist will talk about 15 minutes, maybe at the maximum 15 minutes. And then we will open the floor to get your question, and we will have also, I hope, we will also crossfire each other on the point we are not agreeing, but I hope we could have a vivid the Q&A session too. And this session is broadcasted online on YouTube. So not just the offline participant, but a number of the online audience are also the joining in this session. So once I open the Q&A session, of course, the offline participant audience can just raise your hand, and I'm checking the online, the YouTube question. So if you're joining via YouTube, then there is a link to raise a question. So you can press that link, and then you can leave the comment or question. Okay, and without further ado, let's start our presentation. And for the first presenter, I will invite Professor Kim Inhan. So now the floor is yours. Okay. Sorry, we have. It's very nice photo, so we can hang around for a while. But 네. 이거 좀 체크해 주시겠습니까? 그래요?
알겠습니다. 네네네, 알겠습니다. Okay, good. Hi, everybody. My name is Inhan Kim, Associate Professor, Political Science Department at Ewha Women's University. I thank the Ministry of Unification for inviting me to this panel, and it is my privilege to be here with experts from all around the world. And I especially thank to Professor Lee with your nice remark about me. Thank you. So let me start. At the beginning of the war, not many people expected this war to last this long. Russia, arguably the second strongest military in the world, invaded Ukraine. So the fall of Kiev looked imminent. However, Kiev fought well, fought back hard, and now the war reaches a stalemate. The attention of the world pays to the war. The attention the world pays to the war may be declining, but the significance of the war has never faded away. The war reminds of many important, timeless wisdoms we often forget. So I would like to point out the 4 lessons the war has taught us and discuss the implications we can draw from the war for the Korean Peninsula and especially for South Korea. So let me start from the 4 lessons the war taught us. First, the war, the Russia-Ukraine war teaches us that peace agreement is fragile. So peace agreement is fragile. So since the independence of Ukraine with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Kiev and Moscow had signed peace deals twice. The first was the Budapest Memorandum in 1994. The agreement stipulates that Kiev and Moscow respect each other's independence and sovereignty in the existing borders. They also promised to refrain from threatening or using force against each other. The deal fell apart in 2 decades as Russia annexed Crimea in a forcible manner. Another deal between Kiev and Moscow was the Minsk Agreement in 2014. They promised ceasefire across the Donbas area, But the ongoing war is an outright example that the spirit of the deal has been compromised. So the developments over Ukraine during the past decade all indicate that peace agreement is no more than a piece of paper, inherently fragile and easily ripped apart when a signatory changes its mind, even though the parties involved signed it with a benign intention. Second lesson we can draw from the war is the importance of alliance. For the origin of the war, John Mearsheimer, prominent scholar at University of Chicago, has argued that the war was a result of NATO's decades-long reckless expansion eastward. NATO in general, and the United States in particular, have dismissed Russia's security concerns so that it was hammed into a corner by the hostile security organization. So the war was in many ways a defensive move from Russia, according to Mearsheimer. I'm not going to discuss whether Mearsheimer's interpretation is valid or not, but we have to remember one indisputable fact. That is, Ukraine is confronting alone with the second strongest military power in the world. Given the fact that Ukraine is fighting hard and relatively well against Russia, we need to raise a counterfactual question. That is, would Russia still have invaded if Ukraine had been a member of NATO? Or if Ukraine had had allies with strong military power and resolve to deter Russia's invasion together? Once Winston Churchill remarked that there is only one thing worse than fighting with allies, and that is fighting without them. Quote end. The truth that Ukraine is fighting alone against Russia reminds us of the importance of alliance. The third lesson is closely related to the second. So Ukraine is fighting the war lonely because it has been excluded from the European Union and NATO. So what has discouraged the invitation to the two organizations? One important reason is that Ukraine was known to be corrupt politically and economically. It is a huge contrast with some Eastern European countries which joined NATO and EU earlier with their own efforts to reform domestic politics and economy. So we need to ask another counterfactual question. What if Ukraine had initiated reforms for democracy and market economy earlier and had been accepted as a member of the European Economic and Security Organizations? Could Ukraine have avoided this fate? That is really the question we need to raise. So the fourth lesson we can draw from the war is that we should not have blind optimism about economic interdependence. Whether economic interdependence can bring about peaceful relations among states has been a backbone of debates among scholars and practitioners of international relations. Optimism claims that economic interdependence moderates foreign policy among states involved. So advocates of strengthening economic ties with Russia have argued that importing Russian gas and oil and integrating Russia into the world economy would have pacifying effects on Moscow. Unfortunately, they were wrong. What we have observed for the past several years has totally opposite thing. Russia has become emboldened and had annexed Crimea with confidence that the West would not be able to impose strong sanctions on it. How did they invade Ukraine and never blink an eye in front of the mounting sanctions? Because Russia knows that they have their own trump card in hand. That is, Europe is dependent, heavily dependent on Russia's oil and gas. So, what should we learn from the developments in Ukraine, and what does the crisis in Ukraine Ukraine teach South Korea? What should South Korea should do? Here are three policy implications I can make. First is South Korea needs to make ROK-US alliance stronger. ROK-US alliance has been a linchpin of Korea's security and stability on the peninsula. Seoul needs to remember that it is surrounded by three great powers: China, Russia, and Japan. It will be foolish for Korea, for Seoul, to stand alone against the three. Some may ask, is the United States a reliable security partner? It has abandoned its long-time alliances. Think of Vietnam and Afghanistan. True. Washington has often abandoned its allies, but we should remember that it has been the case when they have not committed to their defenses. Seoul is different. And second, the policy implications I want to say is it is essential for our government to make its democracy and economy more advanced. So South Korea has risen as a dynamic democracy and thriving economy from the ash of the war, the Korean War. But we should not stop here. We should be proud of what we have so far, but we should not stop here. Its democracy and economy need to be more advanced so that it becomes recognized as an exemplary partner of fellow democracies. The third implication of the crisis in Ukraine give to South Korea, that is, it is necessary for South Korea to diversify economically. China has been the largest destination for South Korean exports and the largest source for its imports. So China is an important economic partner. Yet, Seoul has seen Beijing translate its economic influence into political coercion. Seoul has also observed China has adopted a mercantilist approach to trade and intervene economy in an arbitrary manner. So it raises the level of alarm. So Seoul should search for ways to diversify its market for export and sources for imports. And these days, according in response to the U.S. Request to get much closer to the West and the United States in technological cooperation, some elements in South Korea just worries that China and Seoul economically interdependent. The tie is very deep, so we should be careful about it. But I would say Seoul, the new government, needs to see some positive or the chance that by increasing, strengthening cooperation with the West, we may be able to widen the gap and keep the edge over the competition from China. So this is it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kim. Actually, Professor Kim has to leave at 3 p.m. So if other panelists were excused, why don't we? You may directly ask question if you have urgent question. Then I think a very brief Q&A will be helpful. So his 4 lessons of the war and 3 implications. Otherwise, I will proceed the other presentation, and if you have some question, I will arrange a brief minute, 1 minute before he leaves. Okay. All right. And next presenter, I'm very happy to ask Dr. Antoine BONDAZ for the presentation. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor E. It's a great pleasure. And first, of course, let me thank the organizers, the Ministry of Unification, and all the supporting teams who have worked so hard to make this conference a success. And it's always a great pleasure to come from Europe to meet our Korean friends, even though my continent is in great turmoil these last few months. And let me here have a kind of emotional thoughts to the Ukrainian people who was facing since 2014 a Russian aggression, and since 2022 a brutal Russian invasion and war. And Europeans are more than ever united in supporting them. And since the beginning of the invasion last February, a parallel is frequently drawn with the risk of China invading Taiwan. And the impacts of the Korean Peninsula are most of the time ignored, even though they are numerous, direct and indirect. And the war in Ukraine is actually a source of great learning for many actors in the Korean Peninsula. And in these introductory remarks, I will cover 4 dimensions. First, what I call the great return of nuclear-related issues, then the overall negative impacts for South Korea, then the overall positive impacts for North Korea, and the aggravation of the crisis in the peninsula. So first, about the great return of nuclear-related issues. The Russian war against Ukraine is in many ways a conflict in what we can call the nuclear atmosphere. First, Russia sheltered behind its nuclear capability to allow itself to conduct a major offensive operation in what we could describe in France as aggressive sanctuarization. Second, the fear aroused by the military operation around the Ukrainian nuclear power plants, be it Chernobyl, but of course Zaporizhzhia. And third, President Putin's multiple explicit and implicit references to Russian nuclear deterrence and his decision to change the posture of his strategic forces early in the conflict made once again constitutes this kind of nuclear atmosphere. And this war reminds us not only of the importance of nuclear weapons, but also that strategic communication about their possessions matters. And it is no coincidence that in April 2022, North Korea, through the voice of Kim Yo-jong, signaled a de facto change in its nuclear doctrine by implying that it could use nuclear weapons in a military conflict against South Korea, even without a US military intervention. And as I mentioned before, the question of security and safety of nuclear facilities in Ukraine is now being raised. With the delegation of the IAEA experts on their way to the country these days, international cooperation in this area is still vital. And if the role of the UN institutions in Vienna is central, we can recall that Seoul hosted the second Nuclear Security Summit just 10 years ago, whose themes actually appear to be more relevant than ever. Finally, and I will be quite brief because I don't want to get too much into technical details and operational consideration in this panel, but the war in Ukraine has reopened expert discussions about a possible lowering of the nuclear threshold and the use of tactical nuclear weapons. Since 2019, North Korea has conducted several dozen tests of new short-range missiles, be they ballistic, quasi-ballistic, guided rockets, etc. And most studies actually underestimate the importance of short-range missiles and 2 fundamental technical parameters that are the accuracy of these missiles and the capacity to penetrate adversary defenses. And it is essential to take full account of North Korea's growing capacity to implement a strategy based on the graduation of strikes from the tactical to the strategic level, providing it with actually a new capacity to manage a military escalation while having a nuclear deterrent capability. My second point will be the overall negative impact for South Korea. Since the beginning of the war, South Korea has had to clarify what some might call the tightrope foreign policy. The explicit condemnation of Russia and the adoption of economic sanctions obviously has had a political and economic cost for South Korea. So yes, this may reduce the margins of maneuver of South Korea, which intends to maintain stable relations with China and Russia. but it is indispensable to support Ukraine by limiting Russian capabilities and avoiding a Russian military victory. And clearly, these sanctions prevent certain economic opportunities from being seized, especially in the oil and gas shipping sectors in South Korean shipyards. Yet, from a European point of view, a strict implementation of sanctions, a clear condemnation of Russia, and a strong involvement in international initiatives to mitigate the impact of the war, especially in terms of food security, is essential. Finally, and this is a clear lesson from the beginning of the war in Ukraine, human intelligence capabilities are essential to anticipate military action. And if the US had reliable intelligence coming from the highest level of Russian political elite, we can regret that some countries did not believe in the credibility of this intelligence prior to the invasion. For South Korea, this raises actually two fundamental questions: how to get reliable intelligence from a closed country, and how to convince North Korea of its total determination to fight to avoid a conflict. Third, the overall positive impacts for North Korea. Although North Korean diplomats do not say so publicly, as Pyongyang's official position, of course, is that Moscow did not invade Ukraine, they do tell us in private that one of the major lessons of the war is the need to develop a nuclear deterrent and not to give up nuclear weapons. And since Kim Jong-un came to power, these weapons have been institutionalized, what means that they are no longer simply owned by the regime, but are an integral part of its identity, making, of course, their abandonment almost impossible in the short term. These weapons are deterrence weapons, but also identity weapons that reinforce the legitimacy of the regime as part of its survival strategy. And the war in Ukraine only reinforces it. In addition, North Korea's strategic value to Russia is increasing. And we are just, in a way, reliving the precedent of 2014 of, following the invasion of Crimea and Western sanctions, a rapprochement between Pyongyang and Moscow. Today, North Korea has strongly sided with Moscow. Alongside Eritrea, Belarus, and Syria, North Korea was one of the only 4 foreign countries to vote against condemning Russia's military intervention at the UN. However, and Pyongyang, of course, recognized and formed diplomatic ties with the 2 breakaway republics. But it is still too early to see what economic concessions that Russia might offer, the same way they offered 8 years ago, without openly violating UN sanctions. On the other hand, it is quite possible that within the Security Council at the UN, Moscow might be seeking to make diplomatic concession to Pyongyang, protecting de facto the country despite its provocation, and I will talk about it briefly. Finally, the war in Ukraine reminds us of the power of nuisance and the power of economic disruption that Russia has today and that North Korea could have tomorrow. Apart from the impact of sanctions, the economic consequences of the war in Ukraine are actually quite limited, as the Ukrainian economy has a relative importance in the world economy, if not in some key sectors I mentioned before, of course, agriculture. This is not the case for South Korea, which is at the heart of global value chains. Pyongyang already seems to have sufficiently precise strike capabilities to carry out selective strikes against economic targets with a high industrial added value. This economic deterrence capacity is unique to date, as no other major industrial power are exposed to strike systems capable of durably affecting entire sectors of their economy, in sectors that are key to global value chains, with a relatively number of weapons. And last but not least, the aggravation of a crisis in the deadlock. In 2018, despite the unbridled optimism during the 3 inter-Korean summits and the first summit between Chairman Kim and President Trump, I used to play the role of the killjoy by talking about cautious optimism. Today, unfortunately, I think we must talk about cautious pessimism. And I will conclude on this point. The war in Ukraine aggravated the crisis in the Korean Peninsula for at least 3 reasons that I summarized by trivialization, distraction, and division. Trivialization because many are getting used to North Korean tests, especially ballistic ones, with more than 160 tests over the last decades, while underestimating the development of new short-range missiles compared to long-range missiles, and because the response is no longer always automatic to this violation of UNSC resolution. Distraction, because while the war in Ukraine is legitimately at the top of the agenda, North Korea's nuclear and ballistic developments seem to be driven to the background. In recent months, North Korea has conducted several ICBM tests, and the media coverage has been infinitely less than in 2017. And it is essential to attract the interest and attention of the international community, and this conference is more than useful. Last but not least, division, because for the first time since 2006, 2 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council have vetoed a resolution to condemn and sanction North Korea for its violation of international law last May the 26th, which called into question the very credibility of the Security Council. The Russian obstruction at the NPT REFCON a few days ago is another example of this division. However, the main beneficiary of this division is always North Korea, and the loser is more than often international security. To conclude, while the war in Ukraine is far from over, the consequences are being felt every day on the Korean Peninsula. From the North Korean point of view, this war is a unique opportunity. From our point of view, this war is an immense risk, one of losing the North in every sense of the word. It is essential to remain focused on the problem on the Korean Peninsula, including keeping proliferation risk to a minimum while caring about the lives of the North Korean people. Europeans, both at the level of the EU, at the level of the member states, have a role to play and can contribute through concrete initiative, and I have multiplied political recommendations in recent years. And I will be happy, of course, to discuss them with you during the debate and the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. BONDAZ. You have pointed out the both pessimism and cautious optimism or conditional optimism to deal with this crisis, and also the implications on the South and North Korea. We will surely get back to this issue for our Q&A. Okay, our next presenter is Jean Lee. So, Jean, the floor is yours. Still.
Does anyone have any questions for?
Anyone change your mind?
No.
I think. Yeah, I think we can proceed. Well, and if you find a question for Professor Kim, the first presenter, then let me know. Then I will try to figure out a way to get the answer from him in a due the matter.
So I want to thank the Unification Ministry for inviting me to this event. I was happy to host the Korea Global Forum at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. in 2018. So it's nice to be back to the Seoul version of this event. And I apologize, I'm still recovering from illness, so I'm starting to lose my voice. So please bear with me. And I meant to send some images, so I apologize. But what I wanted to start with was to talk about how watching the war break out from the United States reminded me so much of Korea's own wartime history. As somebody who looks at a lot of archival images from the Korean War, I wrote about my own family's Korean War experience. I could not help but make those connections between what we were seeing in Ukraine and what we saw in Korea here in 1950. I mean, none of us were here, but certainly what we see in those images. And it really, those pictures of families leaving at a moment's notice with nothing but what the clothes on their backs and the bags that they were carrying, that's exactly how it was here in Korea in 1950. The difference, of course, is that we are now seeing this unfold in real time. And so it's created a real sense of intimacy and immediacy that we didn't have back in the 1950s. So I think my first response, of course, is that it was so hard to imagine that this is happening again in the modern era. And it's also easy in a way to imagine what impact this conflict is going to have on generations of Ukrainians and Russians as the Korean War has had. I mean, we are here to talk about the Korean War at this event. So many, many decades later, still has an impact on the region, on Koreans, on Americans, on all of us. And it's not hard to imagine that what's happening in Ukraine will have rippling effects for decades to come, for all these families who are divided, and for countries that have been torn apart, in a sense, from people they considered brothers, by an issue that really is much bigger than the people themselves. We're seeing the world take sides, just as we did in 1950. This time, the Korean Peninsula is not the locus of that geopolitical and military action. But still, I think that both Koreas have been drawn into this conflict in their own ways, and that involvement will have implications for dynamics on the Korean Peninsula and in the broader region in Northeast Asia. So since I spent so much time in Pyongyang, North Korea, so I was there I traveled there regularly from 2008 to 2017 as a journalist, very unusual opportunity for an American journalist. What I'd like to do is focus a little bit today on how all of this looks from Pyongyang. And so there will be some convergence with an overlap with what you've said. So I appreciate that. But I also want to acknowledge that so far I've learned so much from both of your presentations. I look forward to your presentation, and I think it's so enriching to have so many different points of view and perspectives brought out in this panel. So first of all, in talking about how this conflict looks from Pyongyang, I should point out that I'm not referring to what the average person thinks, but really just what the few exclusive members who have permission to access outside information in the capital, they're the ones that I will be talking about, because as you know, the average North Korean doesn't have open access to the internet or to foreign broadcasts unless they access them illicitly. And so the version of the Ukraine war that they will be getting will be heavily filtered by the North Korean authorities, and it will be crafted to serve the party's needs. The version that they're going to get is really going to be the narrative of this war that will serve the party's interests. Now, how this conflict looks to policymakers in Pyongyang is interesting, because honestly, if it were almost any other country that had been invaded with force by a superpower, North Korea might have related to that victimized country. But in this case, since that superpower is Russia, one of its main and only allies, the calculation that Pyongyang has to make is far more complicated. So at the moment, as we've discussed, Russia is one of North Korea's only benefactors. And I want to talk a little bit about why that is. North Korea, as you all know, has been retreating into isolation from the international community for several years now. So we always pay attention to the fact that North Korean authorities shut the North Korean borders in January 2020, as we were hearing about the spread of COVID. But I do think that retreat started happening far earlier, in the tense months after the breakdown of the nuclear negotiations with the United States, and that the pandemic provided an opportunity for the North Koreans to complete that withdrawal or retreat and to focus on regrouping. And while the COVID pandemic, it certainly deepened that isolation, I think the strategy was already in place to move away from engagement, that engagement that you alluded to. I don't remember how you described it, but that incredible engagement of 2018, and then back to a phase of stoking tensions with the United States, and of course, beefing up its arsenal, I believe, to position itself for future negotiations, we hope. I think we need to look at Kim Jong-un's foreign policy timeline when we want to consider what kind of calculation North Korea is making. This conflict in Ukraine is unfolding at a time when Kim Jong-un is still embedded in this phase of manufacturing tensions with the United States, with South Korea, and with their allies. And so this is a phase that allows Kim Jong-un to justify building nuclear weapons, even though his country is going through a period of really extreme economic hardship. This timeline means that the only concessions or help that Pyongyang will be willing to accept can come from China or Russia, because help from those countries won't come as quite a political cost as if they were to accept help from the United States and South Korea. And I wanted to mention that I do think that North Korea's recent revelations about COVID might have been crafted to reach Beijing and Moscow in particular. So it's always been my suspicion that the leadership in Pyongyang would take extreme measures to try to keep COVID out. I mean, I've been to many hospitals and clinics. They have very little. Their measures are always preventative because they simply don't have medicine or the capability to care for a massive outbreak. But I also think that there was a propaganda purpose. Kim Jong-un had some major anniversaries to celebrate in the first part of this year, and he wanted to keep the virus out to make sure he had those photos for his legacy. And I suspected even during this period that once that period was over, that state media would start to reveal that there was a pandemic of some kind so that North Korea could in some way rejoin the world. It doesn't mean that, I think the timing of it was just very, very carefully constructed and controlled. The timing of how they were going to, when and how they were going to reveal a pandemic. And I do think that the goal was to appeal to Beijing in particular for help. And I think that's exactly what we saw. I've written about this in the New York Times, that I think we need to be alert to the way that North Korea is using COVID as a way to rebuild relations with Beijing, or may have. This policy and this strategy will keep evolving as the pandemic evolves. And I think we're all seeing that at the moment Beijing does appear to be communicating with Pyongyang, appears to have sent some goods to North Korea, and that is a communication and a collaboration that we are not a part of. And in that same vein, Pyongyang is looking at the war, as you mentioned, the war in Ukraine as an opportunity to curry favor with Moscow. So in July, North Korea joined Russia and Syria in recognizing Donetsk and Luhansk. These are the two breakaway states in eastern Ukraine, so they recognize them as independent states. That same month, the Russian ambassador to North Korea, Alexander Matsugora, told a Russian newspaper that Moscow could hire North Korean workers to rebuild the Donbas region, that region that is now largely under Russian control. And then I did see a report that the Moscow Times said North Korea had shown interest in importing goods made in that region. Earlier this month, according to North Korean state media, the leader of Donetsk sent a letter to Kim Jong-un calling for equally beneficial bilateral cooperation. So as a reminder, sending North Korean workers to Donbas would be a violation of UN Security Council resolutions that called on member states to send North Koreans back home by December 2019. And that was one of the many sanctions designed to stop the flow of money into North Korea's nuclear program. But as we all know, the COVID pandemic broke out very soon after that. So there are many North Koreans who are still overseas, who have not been sent back home, partly because they can't get home. North Korea has not opened that border. So in a way, they are still there. There is a report in VOA about how North Koreans have been trying to fudge their visas to try to extend them in Russia. So certainly in any case, having North Korean workers abroad would be a violation of those sanctions, and also suggests that the sanctions regime is going to be weakened. And I want to shift the focus to how North Korea's propagandists may be characterizing the conflict to the people, given Pyongyang's foreign policy priorities. And I think that this is something you mentioned in your conversations with the North Koreans. I do believe that this will be an opportunity for Kim Jong-un to highlight the importance of nuclear weapons and the need to keep pouring the country's very meager resources into weapons. I think, we could have seen the regime portraying Ukraine's vulnerability as a nation that doesn't possess nuclear weapons. This is what happens when you don't have your own nuclear weapons. But I think that the focus will actually be put on this conflict in the context of the current standoff with the United States and its allies. And by that, it will be what you alluded to, which is the emphasis on how nuclear weapons have given Russia a kind of invincibility in this war, how no one dares to attack Russia because it has nuclear weapons. So I would say that under Kim Il-sung, the first leader of North Korea, North Korea may have allied itself with the smaller, weaker nation under the threat of invasion, but under his grandson, Kim Jong-un, North Korea wants to portray itself as an ally of superpowers, not a small, weak nation, but an ally of China and Russia, and wants to put itself in a similar position of invincibility with nuclear weapons. And this should certainly worry us, not only on a proliferation point of view, but also because that deepening global divide between China and Russia on one side and the United States and its allies on the other obviously has clear implications for the region. I think it's likely we'll see North Korea use that global divide to further its nuclear ambitions. As long as Pyongyang remains locked in this standoff with Washington, Kim will have the rationale to keep building ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons. More testing, of course, will mean more sanctions, and that will deepen North Korea's reliance on its few allies, as well as illicit networks to support the economy, as well as the nuclear program. And so I think that North Korea may be seeking to leverage its public support for Russia on this Ukraine issue in exchange for economic help. So my current area of focus is on North Korean cyber. I see this as a form of the new Kim Jong-un form of illicit money-making and asymmetric warfare. It does allow the North Koreans to get around the border closures as well as to evade sanctions. I think that the role of cyber has been underestimated for far too long. So I'm currently working on season 2 of my podcast series on this issue, and hope that you'll give it a listen and provide some feedback as well. What we do is try to tell people what we think they need to know about North Korea. So even if media coverage is waning, we're still finding that there are a lot of people interested in North Korea through the podcast. When it comes to a strategy on how to curb or stop North Korea's nuclear ambitions, I think the deepening divide also means very weak prospects for getting Russia and China on board with more sanctions against North Korea. I do think that regional unity among North Korea's neighbors is critical to closing the net around North Korea and its nuclear program. But as you mentioned, we saw China and Russia veto the latest attempts at UN sanctions after North Korea's testing. They have in the past signed on to sanctions in the wake of nuclear tests, and those are the very sanctions that Kim Jong-un wanted to have lifted in his negotiations with the United States. But that veto, I think, was a worrying and unprecedented milestone. I don't think it's impossible, but it's going to be extremely difficult as this global divide just continues to deepen. And then there's the challenge of how to engage with North Korea when we're seeing these Cold War alliances deepen. The North Korean people may not be aware of what's happening in the world, but Kim Jong-un is looking at all of this and trying to map out a strategy. He's looking at how to use the Ukraine war as an opportunity to build favor with Russia. He's looking at how to use COVID to get help from China. He's looking at China's COVID policies to try to figure out when the border is going to open up. And he's also, and this is where my Washington point of view comes into play, he's looking at what's happening with the political situation in the United States. And this is probably a topic for a whole other panel, but I do think that the political landscape in the United States, especially if a certain former president manages to sidestep the current controversy and come back into power, it will affect Kim Jong-un's timeline. And that, of course, will affect the timeline for how North Korea engages with South Korea. Right now, it may be a waiting game as Kim Jong-un watches to see what happens in the rest of the world. And unfortunately, that means this issue with North Korea is just going to become more intractable. And for the North Korean people, it's going to mean more hardship as they live through another cycle of provocations and deprivation in the name of nuclear advancement. So I'm just going to make one last point, which is about Washington. So it's clear that Russia and China remain huge foreign policy priorities for the Biden administration. I think these are issues with global impact and implications. And I think it's important to recognize that Korean Peninsula issues will be put into that context. And this is something, Dr. Kim, that you mentioned as well. So it's not going to be what we saw in the Trump years of isolating the Korean Peninsula, isolating North Korea. North Korea and South Korea are going to be part of a broader Indo-Pacific strategy, and that's something that we have to recognize. I do think that it means that South Korea has an opportunity to play a leadership role in the world that extends beyond the Korean Peninsula. And I just had, one last question, which was, I wonder if my fellow panelists and other South Koreans see the parallels between the conflict in Ukraine and the Korean War as I do. I'm just curious. And I wonder if there's been a groundswell of support among the South Korean people to think about the impact this will have on the Ukrainian people and to think about the legacy and impact it will have for generations to come, and perhaps to share some of the insight as a country that has been through this kind of a disruptive and damaging conflict to help them find a way out of it. And if not, I'd be certainly curious to hear why not. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jane. And then we are a little bit behind the schedule, so we will speed up a little bit. So now I will invite Professor Park Young-chun, and he will talk about the Russo-Ukrainian War and its impact on the security order in East Asia. And he subtitled his presentation as whether it's an overture of the Second Cold War era. Nowadays, we began to use the term New Cold War or the Second Cold War. So for that, we will listen to Professor Park's comment. Okay.
네, 국방대학교의 박영준입니다.
My name is Young-jun Park from Korean National Defense University. I'd like to extend my appreciation to Ministry of Unification and Professor Lee.
Presentation in the Korean language, according to this Unification Ministry's request. But I prepare the PPT material in the English base. Okay. 저는 국방대학교에서 사실은
I am from Korean National Defense University, and my specialty is Korean security policy and East Asian region. Based on my specialties, I would like to talk about the Russia-Ukrainian war and its impact on global order. And I would like to tell you whether this is the dawn of the Second Cold War. The Russia-Ukraine war was initiated, but even before that, in East Asia, there was aggressive policies of China against Taiwan. And as Jean Lee said, there was the sixth test of North Korea, and there are more aggressive policies. Amid this situation, in February, the Russia-Ukraine war was initiated, and it has been continued for about 6 months. And this international order or East Asian order is almost similar. And it reminds us the dialogue we had in the beginning of the Cold War in East Asia. In East Asia, there was the trilateral relations. For example, North Korea, China, and USSR was one part, and the Southern Triangle relation was South Korea, Japan, and the US. And Japanese anthropologist Tadao Mesao wrote an article, and he said that China and Russia, the Soviet Union, is at the center of the Eurasia, and Western Europe and Japan have another part, and their backgrounds are different. And totalism has been evolved in the Soviet Union and China. However, in Western Europe and Japan, now there was a development of democracy. So ideologically, Western Europe and Japan have the similarity. That was the dialogue we had in East Asia during the Cold War era. And when we look at the aggressive policies of China against Taiwan, maybe we can think that this is the dawn of the Second Cold War. So we need to understand why Russia is initiating the war against Ukraine. In my opinion, I believe this is the ambition of President Putin. Recently, Alexander Dugin had an influence in Russia, so Russia is now trying to regain its old territory of the Soviet Union. And I believe that was one of the factors in this war. And compared to this, I believe Ukraine was very vulnerable. Ukraine was not a member of NATO, and it did not have allies. And it also gave up its own nuclear power, and it does not have the capability to attack Russia with a long-range missile. That was the second reason. And third, the US and NATO, as a matter of fact, they all showed the deterrence policy. They had the military exercise called the Sea Breeze, and it sent a signal against Russia. However, they were not the allies, so that signal was not delivered properly. As Jin Lee said, there was a similarity between the Korean War and the Cold War we are watching now. So I believe we can observe some similarity, and I also sympathize them. So as you can see, this is the Alexander Dugin, and due to his theory, now the war is unfolding. And now we can see the first phase, second phase, and third phase. The first phase is the operation in the east side and northern side, and it attacked Kiev and retreated. That was the first phase. And from April, we can see the second phase. So it attacked the southern part, and there was a protracted war, and they are shooting each other. And I believe now they're in the third phase. Ukraine is now moving to the Crimean area, and they are attacking back. So compared to the military prowess of Russia, Ukraine is fight back well, and the war is elongated. So then, despite the superior military power, why Russia cannot achieve the win? I believe there was a military mistake of Russia. Russia has a superior military power. However, due to many reasons, they were not able to utilize it fully. And despite the weakness of the military, President Zelensky consolidated all people, surprisingly, and internationally, it is appealing to the society. So the US and NATO, even though they are not the allies, they are providing the support, and Japan is also providing the support, and Korea also expressed our own support. For example, helmet and many other military gears. So now Ukraine is fighting back well, and Russia is having difficult time. However, when it comes to the international order or the order in the East Asia, I believe there are huge impacts. As mentioned by many other speakers, as a result of the Ukraine war, the leadership of the US, based on the alliance, will be strengthened and reinforced. Sweden and Finland announced that it will join NATO, and it almost became the members. And as a matter of fact, Finland, in February, the president announced that it will not join the NATO, but later it turned its position, and now it is trying to become the member of the NATO. And second, countries will spend more money for military defense. For example, 2% of the GDP will be spent for military in Germany, and Japan also made similar announcement. And in the United States, the policy is almost similar. So there will be competition for military spending in the world. And third, NATO countries in Europe and Asian countries such as Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, the linkage will be strengthened. In NATO summit, Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand presidents have been invited. And even though there was a domestic opposition, Korean president participated in the NATO summit. And there will be reinforced relations in the Quad Security Network. Germany also participated in the Quad network and had a joint drill. So Western countries, Western European countries and Japan have similar relations, and now democratic countries in East Asia and European region, they are reinforcing the relations. And fourth, I believe that international institutions are losing its power. For example, in the UN Security Council, they failed to reach a consensus. So at the General Assembly, the resolution was discussed, and some countries and some members opposed. So the UN is now weakening, and many other international institutions are also weakening. At the NPT-US conference, they failed to create the joint communique and close the meeting without the communique. So, as mentioned by many theologians, international institutions have been serving very important parts in maintaining the peace. However, due to this Russian war, the influence of international institutions and organizations will be weakened. And there might be some tragedy of power countries. This is a photo from NATO, and 4 countries participated in the NATO summit, and President Yoon also participated for the first time in NATO meeting. Then what would be the role of South Korea? In the beginning of the Cold War, Korea was a marginal country. So it stayed in the margin in the international order. However, economically and in terms of military, Korea became an important country. And with the development of the economy, it became the member of G20 and OECD. And with the development of democracy, now Korea became an important role. So during the first Cold War, Korea wasn't able to play an important role, but with the growth of South Korea, now in the new order, when it comes to the maintaining the global stability and global new order, Korea needs to play more roles. Geologically, it is close with North Korea, China, and Russia, and there are maritime countries such as Japan and Quad countries. So amid this situation, I believe Korea needs to play more roles. To be specific, considering the geopolitical position, there should be two-pronged strategy. The first one is, since we are a democratic country, with other democratic countries, we need to have a solidarity with other democratic countries, and we also need to fight back against the forces. And in the previous administration, Moon administration, it did not announced clearly about the participation of Quad or any other international alliances. But now, Korea needs to participate in the Quad network, and we need to deter the expansion of the autocratic countries. And President Yoon participated in the NATO summit. That will be the starting point and signal. Second strategy is, despite what I mentioned, instead of taking aggressive policies, Korea needs to take engagement policies. For example, with Russia, China, and North Korea, there are many unfair policies. However, if we take too much aggressive posture, then the tension will be escalated and there might be a security dilemma. So dialogue and engagement should be continued. The Minister of Unification and the Yoon administration announced the audacious initiative. And I believe this initiative is part of the engagement policy. And when it comes to Russia and China, internationally, we need to join our forces to sanction Russia. However, culturally and economically, we need to continue our engagement. Now, when we look at the international order, it is entering into the Second Cold War, and denuclearization of North Korea is getting farther. And China's aggressiveness against Taiwan is getting stronger. So the situation is getting difficult. However, based on our development, I believe we need to be more active. With this, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you very much.
네, 박영준 교수님 감사합니다. Thank you very much, Professor Park. So now we have finished all the 4 presentation, and I somehow, well, they certainly deserve more time for a fuller explanation, but I asked them to be brief as much as possible to save some time for our Q&A. So first, now I will open, without further ado, I will open the floor to get the question from the audience. And if you might need a little bit of time, then I may raise a couple of questions to the panelists. Yep, sure. Oh, sure, certainly. So maybe 1 or 2 brief the question and related with the Russo-Ukrainian war and implication. So you may answer either of this question. One is we have looked at the implication of Russo-Ukrainian war on the Korean Peninsula, but actually another big mirror image is China versus Taiwan. Because if we find an analogy between Russia and Ukraine and the East Asian version, then it will possibly be the China-Taiwan. So how the Ukrainian crisis would have affected the strategy calculation of China or Taiwan? That will be my first question. And another question is the prospect of Russia-China relations, because the U.S. and NATO, European Union, and Asia-Pacific 4 countries, AP 4 countries, Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, are in a sense aligning together. But at the same time, China is getting closer to the Russian side, whether they really prefer it or not. So how should we assess the emerging partnership or alliance, whatever, whichever we choose the term, how should we assess the Russo-China relations? That will be my two questions, and anyone can answer any question. So I don't designate a sequence. Maybe anyone may pick up? Professor Park and Antoine.
이것도 답변을 한국말로 하겠습니다.
I would like to answer in
첫
Korean.
번째 러시아
Professor Lee asked about the Russia and China relations and China-Taiwanese relations. I believe there is a similarity. First, Russia and China are two permanent members of the UN Security Council, and they are showing the territorial ambition against the weaker countries such as Ukraine and Taiwan. And China is also the NPT approved nuclear power, and Russia is the same. And Ukraine and Taiwan are not the countries with nuclear power. So I believe the situation is similar. And Ukraine is not part of the alliance, and Taiwan is not the part of the alliance, even though it has a relation with the US. So internationally, there is no alliance, and they are isolated countries. So in that sense, I believe they have similarities. Despite this, US and NATO are now supporting Ukraine. However, for example, if there is any military aggression from China against Taiwan, there might be a similar situation. Similar responses. And when we look at Japanese position, when there is aggression from China to Taiwan, they feel that it is a huge threat, and ministries are making preparation. However, Korea is not paying enough attention to this. So I believe Korea needs to pay more attention to the relations between China and Taiwan, and it should come up with countermeasures. Second, the relation between Russia and China. Right before the invasion of Russia against Ukraine, Russia and China had a meeting, and there was a communique. And it also announced that they are opposing the unilateralism of the US, and Russia supports the position of China against Taiwan. But once the war was breaking out, then instead of providing direct support, China withdrew from the UN Security Council vote. So indirect support was provided. So depending on the US position, the relations between Russia and China will be determined, whether it will be deepened or not. And now, President Biden's policy will be the key point, whether it will strengthen the relations between Russia and China. And there are some people who want to have the further relation between Russia and China in the US.
Dr. BONDAZ?
I will try to be very brief, because there is so much to say on China-Taiwan. Of course, we draw mostly in Europe actually the parallel between Russia, Ukraine, and China-Taiwan. That this is actually what everyone is talking about, especially this month in August, early August. I think there are one major difference, just one between, there are many more, but I will focus on only one between Taiwan and Ukraine, that the importance of Taiwan within global value chains. Ukraine and the economic consequences of the war are due because of the war, but also a lot because of the sanctions. I'm not saying that we should have not sanctioned Russia, but energy prices are driven mostly by the sanctions, not only because of the war per se. In the case of a war between China and Taiwan, even before adopting sanctions, the economic consequences would be much more massive than the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We talk all the time about semiconductors, but also about many other issues, global shipping lanes, etc. Even without sanction, it would have major economic consequences. So it raises actually one key question. It should raise one question in Europe, in Korea, in the US. We failed to prevent and to deter Russia from invading Ukraine. The key question we should have is, how do we make sure not to fail in deterring China from invading Taiwan? That should be a big question. You know, the question about what kind of sanction we could take, what kind of... I would say if we start thinking this way, that's the second step. The first step is, what can we do to contribute to maintaining the status quo and to prevent China from unilaterally changing the status quo by force? That should be the key question, and that's not the question that is being raised in Europe these days. Second aspect, very, very briefly on China-Russia. I think we've made a huge analytical mistakes in some European countries. I'm not talking about all our European countries, especially a mistake in Western European countries, on the way we analyzed, or at least on the way the relationship between China and Russia was analyzed. Many Western European analysts, including government analysts, believe that you could, in a way, weaken China-Russia rapprochement, that by highlighting that Russia was becoming too dependent on China, you could kind of get back Russia into the European sphere. But this is a complete fail and fake analysis. I mean, Russia was very dependent on Europe in terms of gas and oil exports. And the argument that Russia was irrational to get closer to China did not make sense before the war. We wanted Russia not to get too close to China, but the main reason of the rapprochement between the two countries is because the two regimes share the same concept of national security. And the conception of national security, both in China and Russia, is not primarily based on military or territorial security, but on political security. And more than ever, China is not a threat to the Russian regime. And Russia is not a threat to the Chinese regime. And he explained, I think, a lot about the rapprochement that started in the 1990s. I mean, it's nothing new, but especially the recent rapprochement following 2014 and over the last few months. And I think that key analysis around the concept of political security was not highlighted enough in Europe on that, or at least in Western Europe.
Thank you very much. That was very pinpointed analysis. Okay, sure. Then I have one last question, especially for you. But before moving to that question, I once again ask any question from the floor. Okay, and for time's sake, I would like to ask this question to especially Ms. Jean Lee. We have to find a solution to stop the war and end the war in Ukraine. And on the other hand, the tension is growing also in East Asia, on the Korean Peninsula. And we can have at least 3 different dimensions. One is the economic and economic or energy supply chain dimension. Second cluster of discussions been focusing on political and security issues. But third dimension, maybe one very important dimension's been missing in today's discussion a lot. That is human dimension and humanitarian issues. We certainly have to look at what is happening in Ukraine. Almost like 10 million population had to leave their places, and other all different kind of the humanitarian crisis and crimes that is happening, and also on the other side of the Eurasia, we are still witnessing still the good number of like humanitarian human right abuse and those issues. So how in this time of crisis, how would you mention, how would you comment on the implication between the two, or maybe the common task we have to deal with, especially from the human dimension, humanitarian issues?
Yeah, I'm of course glad that you mentioned that, because at the end of the day, this is about human lives. But I do think that our capacity right now, especially perhaps I'll just mention that here in South Korea is already dealing with a situation on the Korean Peninsula where the nearest neighbors are in an extreme humanitarian crisis. And so in some ways, I wonder if the capacity for compassion is just, it's too much. And then we're also coming out of a pandemic where there's been so much death and illness and disruption, right? So in a sense, but I do think it's important for us to think about the humanitarian aspect. In Washington, D.C., in the U.S., of course, there's been such an outpouring of support for Ukrainians. Similarly, we saw an outpouring of support for Afghans. Part of that with Afghanistan was, I think, because there was a recognition of the U.S. involvement in Afghan for so many years from a military point of view, and that sense of responsibility. I think with Ukrainians, in some sense, many Americans can relate to Ukraine and because they are Europeans, and so there's a sense of a bond that they have. I think I don't have any solutions for the humanitarian aspect. I did want to mention one thing that has been very interesting to watch is, and this comes from my perspective as somebody in the media, the distortion of information and disinformation around the Ukraine war, especially when it comes to how Russia has distorted that information, has been very alarming for me to see because it has such parallels to what I see in North Korea. And it means that I think whole generations of Russians will not have a clear picture of what has happened, what Russia's role is, and the broader implications of that. So that's another interesting point that we haven't discussed, but I think has interesting parallels to our situation here on the Korean Peninsula.
Thank you very much. Now, the time is 3:30. It's about to end the session, and certainly, we also have raised many important issues. Well, still we need to talk more about the whether the efficacy of economic interdependence and how that will affect the peace building. What will be the future condition for the peace building in Ukraine, and how to deal with North Korea in this new how to restart the denuclearization process, and especially in the aftermath of the Russian-Ukrainian war, because North Korea might have learned a lesson that not giving up nuclear would be much more beneficial for their national security and their survival. So, etc. But there are many untold issues. So maybe at some point, hopefully, I would like to bring this prominent panelist again to have a session. But my sincere hope, with two fingers crossed, is by that time, whenever it will be, by the time this tragic war would be over, and we hope we can talk about how to build peace, how to prevent this kind of crisis and tragic event. But in the meantime, the analysts in international relations, the journalists, and policymakers should pay enormous attention, utmost attention, to analyze this crisis and have to find the best solution to end this crisis as soon as possible and to prevent this kind of tragic event in the future. So upon that note, I will wrap up this session. Once again, please give a big round of applause to the prominent presenters. And I also appreciate your sincere attention. This audience sincere attention. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for all. So now the session is over. Thank you.